Well, I wanted to do another session and probably a series of sessions for whoever is interested. And the topic that comes to mind is the topic of God. And I want to approach it sincerely from many years of experience and thought and study. I don't prepare these talks very much, but I do think a little bit about things to say. And I am reading N.T. Wright's 2 volumes on Paul. I'm well into the second volume. He's speaking about the kingdom of God and what that means. And so I wanted to begin what I think will be the first of several sessions, I don't know how many, speaking a little bit about my own personal relationship to God and thoughts about God and struggles with the whole notion of God and the demands that he may or she may put forth, and try to get a grip in a way that who knows who out there in YouTube land will find interesting or helpful. Maybe just 2 or 3 people, I don't know. I was my first experience of God was at a very, very early age in Cuba. I've spoken about this before. I've made a lot of videos now. I think I've made about 97 in English, most of them long, and over 300 in Spanish, most of them very short, or a lot shorter. I was in with my mother in Cuba and wandered off into a sacristy, which is the place where priests get dressed, etc. And there was a life-size, or perhaps even larger than life-size, or at least it seemed to me very large, Spanish crucifix of Jesus on the cross, with the wounds and the bloody knees and the grayish color of death, etc. And I remember having what the great philosopher Rudolf Otto described as an experience of the numinous, of the otherworldly divine type realm, and of a mysterium tremendum et fascinans, a mystery, an unknown, mysterious thing, tremendous in the sense of awe-inspiring or fear, or some sort of caution, or chill down your spine or something, but fascinating in that it attracted you. And this, theologian would say this is an experience of grace due to your sensitivity and your background, your mother's piety, perhaps, even though that was very low key. And my father had a certain piety, even much lower key. But they were, people, I would say God-fearing people who took certain religious things with some seriousness. My mother prayed. I don't think I remember seeing my father praying. My father was very devout of Saint Therese of Lisieux. He had lived in France. He visited the Carmel. He met Celine, her sister. This would have been in the late 1940s. So Therese was already canonized, but I assume his devotion, now that I think about it this way, started a lot earlier, but I don't know. And my mother was devoted to St. John Bosco, and there must have been Salesian contacts there. So the Salesians being the order founded by St. John Bosco, who is primarily the saint of the youth. John Bosco in the Piedmont, north of Italy, around Turin, saw all these, wild, savage young boys, orphans, and very, very poor, given to crime and to all kinds of ways of living on the streets and surviving, etc. And he started taking them in with the help of his mother, Margherita, and eventually, founded this order that is very humane, I think, in general, and very much dedicated to pedagogy and educating the youth, especially with love. I think he famously said, I don't think he invented it, you attract more with honey than with vinegar, etc. Anyway, my mother was very into all that, I think. I mean, I saw it to a large extent. So, with this kind of sort of breeding ground or whatever, I somehow encountered the numinous or the divine at a very early age. I don't know if I was 4 or 3 or more likely 5. I don't think I was 6, because by the time I was 6, I was already in first grade. And 7, I was in second grade in Cuba. And by that time, I was not having these religious kinds of experiences. But the uh, experience and the fact of God was with me. And I remember that my mother took me out of the Catholic school second semester of second grade, because by first semester the teachers were already speaking about, I think it was Eisenhower or Kennedy. Of course, this would have been 1960. So that, yes, Eisenhower was still in power and Kennedy would win the election. So these two guys were mentioned, and I had no idea what they were talking about. But Castro had taken over in 1959, January 1. So that already you had this revolutionary ferment, a lot of it directly against the Yankees or the Americans. And of course, communism, and they were taking over farms, etc. I think they called it intervenciones. They would intervene, confiscate property of the very rich first, etc. And my mother, a very simple, conservative woman, not by any means a right winger. My mother was very, very social, liked, body jokes, liked the common people. She was common origins herself, high school degree, had been a sales, girl at Sears. But she was God fearing enough and intuitive in her own way enough that when these bearded revolutionaries came into Havana in 1959, and I do remember seeing them, and maybe that not in 59, but in 60, seeing them go to the bodegas, the little markets in the neighborhood. She did not like these unkempt, or what looked to be to her dirty, bearded revolutionaries. So she saw that early on. My father was not a very political man, and neither was my mother. My cousin was, and he was the intellectual, and he was the one that joined the 26th of July movement, which was Castro's movement. Yesterday was the 26th of July. And so he was fascinated with that. And only much later at Georgetown, where he was studying English or something, he met a Polish professor who told him, if you think Batista is bad, wait, because Batista's people had arrested my cousin. Wait till he was a law student. Wait till you see what's coming after. It's going to be worse. So anyway, it's an example of my mother's kind of intuition that bested my intellectual cousin's thoughts on all this. But in any case, I did do my. She had me do my first communion in Cuba and prepare for it as was required. And I remember that I was preparing for it at the La Salle school where I had been basically removed from the second semester of second grade, so that whether the priests there made the exception or I don't know how that worked, that I was instructed in how to do confession. At least that I went to confession before I did the first communion. And then we did the first communion not in the campus that I attended, which was the Marianao campus, suburban, if you will, but in the old Havana Vedado campus, much grander, much older, much more magnificent. And the auxiliary bishop of Miami, of Havana, Eduardo Boza Masvidal, was the one who gave out communion, officiated at the mass. And I remember taking all that, very seriously. I'm gonna try to get a picture here. That's not gonna be. I hope it's quicker than it might seem. Um, I did my first communion, and they took my picture, touched it up a little bit, but I look incredibly serious. I was 7 years old. March 4, 1961. In a few months I would be 8 years old. But I did do my first communion very seriously, and I did feel, I think for a 7-year-old child, probably above average, the seriousness and the significance of this first communion. This outfit was not my own. My mother borrowed it from somebody probably well off. It's got all the works, the coat, and everything else. But that rosary, white rosary, and that white prayer book, I kept for many, many, many years. The rosary, I finally sort of, got rid of, or it broke. The book I still have. And so I've kept that book since 1961, 60 years. Then when we moved to Miami, Key Biscayne, my parents, I had a very dysfunctional family. And so with all the pressures of my father, who was home all day, he had retired very early, had been a big fisherman, sports fisherman in Cuba. In Miami, he resumed fishing, but wasn't quite the same. He was older, and just the facilities and how far money went and all that with a yacht, which he still bought another, 37-foot yacht. Being in the house and his own temperament and all kinds of other things that I'm not going to get too much into with this topic today. And my mother long suffering and having to put up with all this stuff and having to attend to him before she got a chance. She was free and got a chance to go off and see her big, nice circle of fun loving women friends. These fights affected me quite a bit. Arguing, and my father had a vicious tongue, which I've inherited to a large extent. I would, kind of freak out. And I did turn to prayer, and I turned to the rosary, maybe to this very rosary that I'm holding in my hands that I brought from Cuba. We brought very few things from Cuba. In fact, we thought we were going to be in Miami a few weeks before Castro fell. In fact, 11 days after we left Cuba, April 6th, on the 17th of April, the Bay of Pigs invasion took place. Of course, that failed within 3 days, and we knew that our stay in Miami would last a long time. How we got a whole bunch of pictures and a whole bunch of family memorabilia and stuff like that out of Cuba, I think relatives or others that would come to Miami brought enough of it that we have, wonderful albums of the family and things like that. So, um, but the rosary, I'm sure I brought with me in the book. I mean, I don't remember it, but I doubt that. Well, I don't know whether somebody else brought it later. The point being that I spent a good part of my childhood turning to prayer in these moments of crises. And this is something that most people do. God is the recourse. We turn to God. We say, "Oh my God," and "God help me," or whatever, because this is a concept or a being that human nature, I think, is hardwired to conceive of and to be turning to all the time. I've written enough about it, I suppose, according to my humble light, poor lights, in God an Essay, which is on my website, Emilio Chavez Bible Explainer, or Chavez Bible Explainer. You should be able to get my website. I think under theological writings or something I would have. Um, in fact, I can look for it now. It's the beauty of the internet. So Bible Explainer, it says not secure, don't worry about that one. God and Essay, it's actually separate. And I try to do a little philosophizing as I did when I was, in divinity school, etc. From an anthropological point of view, how we are as human beings oriented toward these, from a Freudian or psychological point of view, these would be projections or results of guilt. I've read a lot of Sigmund Freud, and I really admire Sigmund. He's one of my guys, but I'm not sure that everything he said. I mean, I don't agree, of course, with atheism, which is a subject I do want to talk about. Grappling with, is this only our projection and our need, a crutch that some other people developed in a certain other way, maybe more, do without. But I am convinced that believers in general tend to have done things that are more beneficent to the world than real militant atheists. But believers of many stripes have also done incredible harm to the world. And so that is not an easy argument to make. But when I think of believers in the sense that I was talking about, I'm thinking of St. Francis, St. Dominic, and others, others that have done. When you hear of these missionaries, Mother Teresa, going off to very difficult places, or people that because of some sort of belief. I'm not an expert on Albert Schweitzer, but he did go to the Congo as a medical doctor, being a genius, wrote about Jesus and all that. So you have examples of altruism and selflessness usually come from believers, not only. The Dutch have had great humanitarians that sometimes were not believers. But I want to talk about what God can provide or does provide, even though there may be struggles involved in this search for God or for a relationship with God. So in my life, to try to give a sort of autobiographical narrative that might shed light on my own journey, which might be applicable or at least relatable to other journeys. I did like religious rituals. Freud says it's related to guilt to some extent. But nevertheless, I made a very strange prayer when I was around 12, I believe. I must have intuited that I would go into a rough puberty period that would last for some years. And I actually made a prayer to God that I remember. I know that I will abandon you, but when I turn 18, please bring me back to you. It's a strange thing. And so, yes, at 13, I started kind of derailing in some ways. I was hanging out with a little older crowd. I wanted to run away from home. At 14, my father had his first heart attack. I freaked out. I actually tried to commit, suicide by swallowing 9-Librium, tranquilizers that he took, which my psychiatrist, I was going to a psychiatrist, a great guy I want to remember, Gabriel Casuso, a student of Anna Freud. I was 14 and I would go to his beautiful, beautiful office, very fancy, in the Jackson Memorial Hospital complex. And he would smoke these very fancy little cigarette types with like a purple, fancy, shiny filter or something. And I met him years later when I was 18 and I was in college. And I told him I wanted to be a rock star, be in a rock band. And he kind of counseled me against it, but did say that I had matured from the time I was 14. Anyway, this doctor later did a couple of wrong things with his marriage, and then his wife, very noble, I think a Dutch woman, took him in his old age, and he died. But in any case, I was really in bad shape. He said that 9-Librium wouldn't kill a fly, etc. And so that was a moment. At 15, I began arguing against the existence of God. I awakened intellectually, etc. And I thought that the whole thing about God was not true, especially because of theodicy, which means the justification of God. How can an all-powerful, all-good God allow so much evil? So that what I was doing at 15, 16 was very much what, probably thinking, bright, young, teenagers do. Had tremendous debates, even with priests on the beach. I remember one, a guy from Loyola University, who left me a matchbook, which I still have. And he says, well, I'm not offended by you. You're a young man with a head on his shoulders, etc. I later wrote to him after my conversion. 16, I kind of stayed home for about a year. I was reputed to be reading the encyclopedia, the World Book Encyclopedia. I was into movie stars, etc. And then I came out again with my group of friends in Key Biscayne, the Key Rats, and was just kind of a wild but nevertheless conscientious teenager. And then at 18, I went off to University of Florida. Very confusing times. I remember that I didn't believe in God. I remember the Campus Crusade people came to my dorm room one day and said that if I had accepted God in the past, which I had, that would stay with me, or that would be a valid ticket or something forever, which comforted me. And I was actually reading the Bible at night simply out of intellectual curiosity, not because of devotion. I was smoking pot and all this stuff. I dropped out third quarter, first year, University of Florida. I had a friend that committed suicide, all kinds of crazy stuff going on in Gainesville in 1971, 72. I came home and um, my parents were distraught that I had dropped out of school. My mother came to my room very in her normal, humble, tactful, kind of scared way because I was a little beast spoiled by my dad. And she said, "Your father says you have to go to work." So I started working at a factory which laminated bathroom partitions. I would mix the glue that was used to spread on these covers of the pressed board or wood or whatever it was to make it a nice, smooth, shiny bathroom partitions, what I recall it they were. During those 3 days that I worked in that factory, I went to my last concert. And I've skipped some experiences with LSD, but I went to my last wild concert where the Steppenwolf singer was singing. I've talked about this before, I think. And I had another freak out on LSD where I experienced myself as dead along with everybody else in the Hialeah Fronton, which was this sports arena somewhere in Miami. I have no sense of direction, whether it was Hialeah or some other place. I didn't drive. I was driven to these places. I was out of it anyway most of the time. Even if I'm not out of it, I don't know where I am most of the time. I have to look at a map or something. And they had these nets to catch the Hialeah balls. This is like a form of Basque, you know, baseball where you have these handheld nets that you throw against. It's like handball, but with nets in your hand, some sort of a glove that's really made out of straw or something. And the nets to me seem to be the interior of a coffin, and the people dancing there with some older adults seem to me to be the souls of the dead. And the older people, the grieving parents of youth who had crossed over and were now ghouls or ghosts or something. So you can imagine, and this was after a series of bummer trips. I had Garden of Eden trips, I had crucifixion trips where they were going to crucify me. I had purgatory and hell aspects of trips where I thought I was in hell. The hallmark of that being that there's no end to hell. And since I couldn't sleep, it was just horrible. There was no rest at all, from this situation. And of course, you come down from the trip. This was in Sebring, the Sebring races, precisely in 1972, the spring of 72. A month after that trip, literally to Sebring and on LSD, that's when I dropped out of University of Florida, came back to Miami. Then I had that last bad trip, probably June of 72. And differently from other trips, when I woke up the next morning, I'm omitting a lot of details, I said to myself, enough of that. The whole time it had been a struggle between, it looked like God and the devil fighting for me. Um, you know, I was definitely being torn by two forces. And one force was a force of good, and the other force was destructive for sure. Now that I think about this again and express it this way, really for the first time like this, I realize, all the psychological resonances involved in this. From a psychoanalytic point of view, it would be very clear to explain projections and personifications, objectifications, etc. From your unconscious, subconscious, semi-conscious, whatever. But then we come to having understood that, and I've studied enough psychology for sure. Once you understand all that, what I got very clear, and I think my reading of certain theologians like Karl Barth and others, what remains very, very clear, Kierkegaard, I'm reading his journal at night now. He was a tortured kind of soul. What remains very clear is that faith is a choice we make, a decision we make, but which has been prepared and aided mysteriously by God, if that's what the conclusion you come to, which is what the conclusion of faith comes to, that God works in mysterious ways. God wants you. Because of the traditional doctrines that we have learned, well or ill, basically meaning there is a God, he is self-sufficient unto himself, and when he decides to create, it is only because of love, not because of a need. Unless you were to posit a sadistic being that likes to have toys with which to mess, then you would say this God is morally inferior to me. I mean, I don't want to, torture anybody. So what kind of God can there be who is very powerful, but instead of all good, he's actually a sadist? You sort of dismiss that. I will tell you about an experience that I had. So I just talked about when I was 19. God did what I prayed for, not when I was 18, but when I was 19. And that led me to the Dominican order. I'm skipping over that for the time being. I went to Mexico, 1973, 74, 75, 76. Then to Washington, D.C. with the Dominicans. I left the order, came back to Miami, went to Florida State for 3 quarters to graduate from college with 5 years of college, majored in philosophy, minored in religion without really taking any religion courses, just from all the stuff I had done in Mexico and in Washington. with the Dominicans in schools. And then I applied and got into Harvard Law School. I had by that time in Florida State determined to become an atheist again as a type of liberation from the intellectual and maybe even behavioral constraints of being a believer or a Christian believer. And this is a tough one to share. My first year, I was as miserable as one can be studying law, or not studying law, but being in law school. I hated the law. I hated everything about it. I went over to the divinity school and I said I could switch over, but decided to stick to the law school and eventually made it and graduated. But this first year was awful. And after I had some bad exams and everything, second semester, I obtained a quantity, let's just say, of illegal substances and holed up for about a month or so in my apartment in February in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with snow and the cold. Every morning I would walk down my Harvard Street, turn into whatever the next street was, go to this little market, buy, Chinese egg rolls to heat up in the oven. I'm not going to get into all the details of what I was doing. I was singing and recording myself, trying to break out as a rock singer. I actually auditioned for several bands in different places. And I would go to bed late at night and pray that this incredibly disordered life would be straightened out by God, in whom I had no faith. But I think as Ronner, the theologian, said, you can pray to have faith or something. And sure enough, and this is what I wanted to get to, and I've written a little one page on it. I was in my apartment as I was beginning to feel better and had gotten rid of these drugs, and spring was approaching or almost in the air. And I was sitting in my apartment on Harvard Street in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I felt like a powerful presence, God, come in through this. I always thought of it this way: a little glass pane above my door to the balcony. And all of a sudden, I had this, it was like an invisible flying saucer or just heavy presence oppressing upon me, like about to crush me. And my experience was, my thought was, this guy's going to crush me. And my second thought was, he's so powerful. If he wanted to crush you, he could have done so already. So I discerned that this oppressive elephant in the room, so to speak, was benevolent, benign, good, because he could have crushed me and didn't. Had come to me. Why was he fooling around with me? It wasn't a sadistic gesture on the part of this presence. It was a visit at a key moment where I needed a real kick, in the good sense, not in a punishing sense, but in a liberating sense. That push, that priming of the pump so to speak, that gets the water flowing, the living water flowing again. And so I went to confession the next day with tears and the whole bit. And since that day in 1979 spring, I have, I don't think I've been able to doubt that God exists. A lot of things have happened to me and I've done since 1979. But doubting that there's a God and trying to go back again to that atheistic mode that I was trying to cultivate with all my resources, basically, that has never been possible again. Now, wrestling with the whole God thing is a second part of the story, which I will save for next time. But of course, the easy part for me, and it's happened in more than one case in my life, I had already done all the homework. I had already gone through theology and philosophy in Mexico, and I had all the infrastructure necessary to then upload, if you will, the whole God experience and what it meant. Just like when I arrived in Rome in 1996 to study biblical theology at the Gregorian University, I had notebooks of translations of the Greek New Testament done by myself and of part of the Hebrew Bible done by myself. And a priest who was enrolling at the same time as me in this licentiate program in biblical theology said to me, "You've done all this work already. You are so advanced and prepared." And sure enough, I didn't need to go through the ropes that the typical entering student, the overwhelming probably majority of entering students in the license program, most of them priests already, so they had gone through priestly studies. They had not done the linguistic, scriptural work that I had done. So I was blessed in having a whole arsenal with which to assimilate, interpret, and appropriate my new experience of God. And so that is the foundation that I have, and try as I might to undermine it, and I have tried. And nevertheless, it's there. It's like the rock that God is supposed to be in the Old Testament. Paul says that rock that followed the Israelites in the desert was Christ. So approaching 45 minutes, less than that, which is what I really want to limit these talks to. Unfortunately, I was thinking about if I did 13-minute ones like I did for the Spanish radio, or maybe 20 minutes, would that be a lot more palatable to most people? Well, probably, I guess, I don't know. But I am not capable, and my style is not capable of, those 200 2,500 words or less. I have to ease into my topic and cover what I think is a sufficient amount, and then leave the rest for next time. So let's say that I will continue to share personal experiences and try to relate them to what it might mean to theology, psychology of religion, if you will. And when I say theology, understanding how God works, questioning perhaps dogmas or traditional beliefs, and how I approach them according to my poor lights, but nevertheless, uh, according to a lot of experience struggling with all this stuff. and I'm going to end there.